So yesterday, I think probably, of course, we were looking at Article 2 of Question 58, whether justice is always towards another. And sort of the guiding principle for that question was this understanding of what St. Thomas calls metaphorical justice. Now, we saw a few dimensions of this metaphorical justice in the question itself, and especially this understanding in faith of justification, what happens in the soul of a baptized person, and then someone who actively lives their faith life. There's this justification that's taking place by grace in the soul of that person. So everything that was in disarray because of original sin then begins to come back into order by having that first principle in the right spot. And that's this contact with God, right? Faith is an adhesion to God. It's an act of the intellect. Sometimes we don't give faith enough credit. Faith is an act of our intellect. It's the most, it's the deepest act our intellect can make, can pose, is adhering to the mystery of God. That's what faith is. It's like attaching myself spiritually to the mystery of God. That's what faith, that gift of faith is for. And that is that rational principle, so to speak, that then brings everything and is capable of bringing everything else back in order. Now, so that's, in a sense, metaphorical justice, because we're talking about something that's happening, a reordering of things that's happening within an individual. Now, the virtue of justice is talking about people amongst themselves. So the relationship with another, not within myself, but with another. So a bit of clarification on what the scriptures are talking about when they use the word justice. A little bit of clarification also with these two senses, metaphorical justice and then the virtue of justice. And then something that we mentioned briefly at the end were how we could look at politics, so the justice between men, as a sort of projection of the justice, the metaphorical justice that's inside of a virtuous person. So someone whose life is well-directed, well-ordered, would understand the different passions, emotions, other virtues that are at play within themselves. Okay? Now you can transpose that into see how a government might function, how a political system would function. Well, you obviously want in charge the most rational bit. That's so funny because it doesn't turn out that way all the time. But what's interesting is that you can see a reflection of, in fact, what happens inside of ourselves. What's vying for power, what's vying for control within us, what's vying for control within a political system. Well, it's not always the most rational element. That which wants to be in charge is not always that which is best prepared to be in charge or has the qualities that would be required for being in charge.
You're saying we all have a little bit of Donald Trump inside
I'm saying that for the part of us that is not yet brought into that full justification, that full transformation in Christ, there's something in us a bit like Donald Trump in an analogous way. So, I mean, it's interesting to kind of play off of these different images because it helps us, once again, if St. Thomas ventures out into these sort of images, it's to help us understand the virtue of justice better. And then even to take a look at where the risks of a system of government would come in. Well, if you want an aristocracy where there's some sort of like control that's had by a group of people, what about wisdom? Because really, even among the intelligent, there's not always wisdom. What if you want a democracy where everybody gets their own voice? Majority rules. Well, that's what happens when you live an unvirtuous life on the inside, basically. My gut tells me I should do this. My mind tells me that I should do this. We're just going to see who screams the loudest. Well, guess what? Your gut will scream louder, or your emotions will scream louder, will make more noise. Good. Okay, moving on. Article 3. Just a little foray into what we looked at last time. Let's start with objection 1. So just a reminder for those of you who might have missed a few. So when we read these articles, this is the way that we do it with the Brothers of St. John when we read through the Articles of St. Thomas. We always read the first objection, and then we skip to the body of the article and make sure that we've understood the body of the article. Sometimes the objection is helpful, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it simply introduces the question. Then we go back and we read the objections and the responses. And then usually the way Thomas has it set up is that those objections and the responses to the objections deepen or specify something that might not have been completely worked out in the body of the article. So let's start then with objection 1 of Article 3. So question, whether justice is a virtue. Okay. Ted.
Objection 1. It would seem that justice is not a virtue, for it is written, "When you shall have done all these things that are commanded you, say, we are unprofitable servants. We have done that which we ought to do." Now it is not unprofitable to do a virtuous deed, for Ambrose says, "We look to a profit that is estimated not by pecuniary gain, but by the acquisition of godliness. Therefore, to do what one ought to do is not a virtuous deed, and yet it is an act of justice. Therefore, justice is not a virtue."
Okay. Let's see, what word or what concept within that objection is sort of like the focus of the objection?
Unprofitable.
Sure. So this notion of profit. And a virtue has to be profitable. Yet the scripture says that if you do what you are supposed to do, why do you think you should get any reward? So the rewards of doing what's right, you're an unprofitable servant, right? We are unprofitable servants. We have done that which we ought to do. So no reward, no profit should be coming to me for doing what I was supposed to do anyway. There's kind of the heart of the objection. So we've got a notion that's coming to us from our faith, right? About, am I doing this to be rewarded, or am I doing this out of obedience? Okay, what's the motivation? That's really kind of where the heart of the scripture is at. What's my motivation for doing what's right? Obedience to God, faith. Okay. Now, however, at the same time, we cannot deny that with good actions, there is a sort of, not necessarily like, a piece of candy, but the reward of having done a just deed is what it says, not estimated by pecuniary gain, but the acquisition of godliness. There is something that comes to us from virtue. But we'll see how St. Thomas deals with that particular problem. Does everybody understand where the objection lies? Now, obviously, the objection is not enough to just throw out virtue completely. But it is an interesting point about profit at a human level, profit at a divine level, not profit in monetary sense, of course, but that glory or that honor or that gain that would be coming from virtue. Let's read the body of the article. Savannah.
I answer that?
Mm-hmm.
I answer that a human virtue is one which renders a human act and man himself good. And this can be applied to justice.
Okay, we missed the on the contrary, I think.
Oh, okay. On the contrary, Gregory says that the entire structure of good works is built on 4 virtues. That is temperance, prudence, fortitude, and justice.
Okay. Do you understand so part of it is just understanding why that's important reasoning in there for St. Thomas, understanding why he's putting those things in. So why did St. Thomas put in that line? On the contrary, Gregory says, da-da-da-da. This is to help you think as a theologian.
I guess it seems like he's countering what he just was talking about. He was basically stating justice is not a virtue, and on the contrary, it is. He's saying that someone else says that it is.
And he bases it on Gregory.
Gregory.
Okay, so there's the argument of authority. Gregory says there's 4 virtues that around which the entire structure of good works is built. So we've got good works, okay, there's a kind of profit there, and we've got the 4 virtues, and justice is one of the 4. And it answers the question whether justice is a virtue. And it kind of touches on the first objection. But we need...
touching on it, I'm sorry, because he's saying like you couldn't do those good works that are required of you without the virtues.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a requirement of the virtues in the good works. The entire structure of good works is built on 4 virtues. It's part of the ethical structure. And so Gregory's simply stating that. And St. Thomas, as a theologian, is leaning on the authority of St. Gregory in that said contra. Now, St. Thomas begins to reason through the problem. So, keep going.
I answer that a human virtue is one which renders a human act and man himself good, and this can be applied to justice. For a man's act is made good through attaining the rule of reason, which is the rule whereby human acts are regulated. Hence, since justice regulates human operations, it is evident that it renders man's operations good. And as Tully declares, good men are so called chiefly from their justice. Wherefore, as he says again, the luster of virtue appears above all in justice.
Okay, so what is St. Thomas doing? He's not doing anything too complicated, but what is he doing in that passage, in that part?
Again, it seems to me that he's just saying that, like I don't think he's not contradicting the scripture,
No.
but he's just saying that in order to do the good things that are commanded of us, we have to have virtue to do them, right?
Yeah, I think specifically in this part, what he's doing is he's just showing how justice as a virtue fits in to our understanding of what virtues are. So, this is what a human virtue is. This is how justice meets that understanding of what a human virtue is. Man's act is made good through attaining the rule of reason. And then he even goes on to say that good men are so called chiefly from their justice. That's interesting. So you don't call someone good because they're temperate. Oh, he's a good man because he's temperate. But the goodness and justice is this, and that's this word luster of virtue appears above all in justice. So that's an interesting point about justice as one of the cardinal virtues that expresses goodness most. Now, why do you think that might be? That's an interesting question. Why would justice, more than prudence, more than temperance, more than fortitude, give this kind of luster to goodness?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is like you could be trying to be temperate, prudent, and fortitudinous for your own sake, but not out of like in right relation to other people.
Exactly.
So other people might be like, well, that's great that you don't pig out on food, but you didn't give me the $5 you owed me.
Well, and assuming that you were technically, in order to be virtuous, you have to have all of the virtues. You can't just only be temperate, because in fact there's a lack of prudence somewhere if you're not. So all of the virtues come together.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just. I'm really temperate, but I'm unjust.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't quite work out. But if someone has all of the virtues, what draws or makes them attractive, so to speak, their goodness shows forth through justice.
Mm-hmm.
And so someone who is perhaps particularly just, not to the not having lost any of the other virtues necessarily, but is particularly just, particularly attentive to the good of others, well, yeah, absolutely, we can understand why that would make him radiate with goodness. Whereas the other virtues, which are centered more on that kind of political control over our own self, that rationalize, that organization of our own self. I mean, it's good for you, but it's not good for anybody else necessarily. But by justice, we become good for others, which is interesting. Whereas the other virtues, we become good for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a pretty interesting point of how justice is unique among the four cardinal virtues. Let's continue. So what we're going to do now, Regina, is we're going to hop back to objection 1, reread it, and then read the reply.
It would seem that justice is not a virtue, for it is written, when you shall have done all these things that are commanded you, say, we are unprofitable servants. We have done that which we ought to do. Now it is not unprofitable to do a virtuous deed. For Ambrose says, we look to a profit that is estimated, not by pecuniary gain, but by the acquisition of godliness. Therefore, to do what one ought to do is not a virtuous deed, and yet it is an act of justice. Therefore, justice is not a virtue.
Before we read the reply, do you have any thoughts, any guesses as to how St. Thomas would look at it, unless you already read it? Because I know sometimes you read it ahead.
I didn't read it.
Okay, guess maybe how St. Thomas might deal with that objection. This is just to make things more interesting. It doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. How might St. Thomas deal with this objection?
Like anybody else? Yeah.
Regina, but really anybody, if you think you're like, I have an idea, jump in.
The only thing that comes to my mind is that he might go after the word profit.
Okay.
Or the concept of it. I don't know how he would do it. But.
Okay. Any ideas, anybody? We can also just read the reply.
I figured he was going to focus on that and how it's related to your relationship with God versus more of a human relationship.
Okay.
I would say he was going to say something about that doing what we should do is virtuous.
Right. Because there's the different motivations there too, right? Doing what we ought to do. Well, I mean, just because I do what I ought to do doesn't make it not virtuous.
Mm-hmm.
That seems like the exact contrary of what we mean by virtue anyway.
Mm.
I should be able to do what's right because it's what I want to do. Also, well, virtue's maybe somewhere in there. Let's see what St. Thomas says.
When a man does what he ought, he brings no gain to the person to whom he does what he ought, but only abstains from doing him a harm. He does, however, profit himself insofar as he does what he ought, spontaneously and readily. And this is to act virtuously. Hence it is written, that divine wisdom teacheth temperance and prudence and justice and fortitude, which are such things as men example, virtuous men, can have nothing more profitable in life.
Okay, let's first try to just make sure we got what's the key here about the first part of that reply. How does he qualify what it means to act virtuously?
I mean, he abstains from harming somebody else in the process by doing what he ought to do. So he's not bringing harm to somebody else.
It's not actually giving gain to that person either.
Right, so that's the exterior level. So on an exterior side, not wronging is right. Now interiorly, what are these dispositions that St. Thomas talks about that makes that act virtuous?
So
doing what you ought to do.
He's able to do what he ought to do easily. He's able to do it spontaneously and readily.
Spontaneously and readily. And those are the two also when we talk about obedience. So that's an important thing for us as we live our lives of faith. Now, to act in faith well is to do it spontaneously and readily. So when our faith is challenged, when we're, okay, what would make that a good act of faith? Well, if it's spontaneous and without putting any obstacles in it. Obedience, spontaneous and ready to obey. That's when we talk about religious obedience. What does it mean to be? I mean, you can obey dragging your feet. I mean, that's no profit in that kind of obedience. But to do it spontaneously and willingly, readily, that there's merit in that, there's profit in that, and it doesn't have to be something that I invented. What I ought to do, but then it's how I do what I ought to do that makes it virtuous, spontaneous, and willing. Okay, now the second half. Let's understand that quote from Wisdom. Wisdom teaches temperance, prudence, and justice, and fortitude, which are such things as men. Such things as men can have, nothing more profitable in life. Okay. So this is a quote from Scripture that we could use to show a contrary understanding of that other passage from the New Testament, which is even in Scripture we see the four virtues mentioned. Interesting. 4 cardinal virtues. So, Book of Wisdom. So if you're looking for scriptural references for the virtues, that's your main one right there. 4 cardinal virtues. Any questions on that? Okay, let's hit objection 2. Who's up? Catherine?
Yep.
Okay.
Further, that which is done of necessity is not meritorious. But to render to a man what belongs to him as justice requires is of necessity. Therefore, it is not meritorious. Yet it is by virtuous actions that we gain merit. Therefore, justice is not a virtue.
Okay. Do we see where the objection is situated?
It seems really similar to the first one.
Okay. Let's understand this word necessity. What kind of necessity is justice looking at?
Like a spiritual necessity, is that what you mean?
There's
Versus
different,
it's not like
right?
a physical bodily need or something.
Right. So there's whatever is compelling that need for justice is not something. It's not it's a necessity that doesn't come from the physical world.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a necessity that comes from the passions.
Mm-hmm.
It's a necessity that comes from, as Catherine said, a spiritual understanding of things. Just so there's already a kind of recognition that's required for justice to be had that goes beyond the simple observation of the world around you. Something has to be understood about how different persons, different supposits, that was our word from the last article, are interacting or should interact. Okay? So there's something a little bit funny about the understanding of the word necessity, maybe. And then meritorious. How do we gain merit? And it says here, virtuous actions gain merit. It's not meritorious of justice because it's done of necessity. But can you think of other virtuous actions that are done of necessity? The selflessness of a mother, for example. There's a necessity that a mother be selfless, or a father. You can't be that. You can't be selfish and be a mother. You can't be selfish and be a father. It breaks down. It's an impossible kind of relation to have to a child if you insist on being selfish. So there's a necessity, so to speak, in that kind of generosity with children. Does that make motherhood or fatherhood something without any merit? Well, absolutely not. So we have to understand now, something heroic. Okay. Now we're looking at merit in a different light, as though the only thing that could bring us merit was something heroic. Is merit only had by heroic actions? Is justice heroic? What would a heroic act of justice look like? Interesting question, just to marinate on. Let's look at what St. Thomas says in reply to this objection. You can write those down. Those are great, discussion questions, by the way.
I'm going to write that down before I go.
Yeah, don't forget it if you think it was worth thinking about. All right,
That's me. I'm just finishing writing my sentence.
No problem.
Thanks.
We're already reading ahead, but we're waiting for you.
Good. And this will just reinforce what you read. Reply to objection 2. Necessity is twofold. One arises from constraint, and this removes merit, since it runs counter to the will. The other arises from the obligation of a command, or from the necessity of obtaining an end, when, to wit, a man is unable to achieve the end of virtue without doing some particular thing. The latter necessity does not remove merit when a man does voluntarily that which is necessary in this way. It does, however, exclude the credit of supererogation, according to 1 Corinthians 9:16. If I preach the gospel, it is no glory to me, for a necessity lieth upon me.
Okay, this is famous supererogation. That's a similar sort of thing as what we have. I'm an unprofitable servant. I have only done what was commanded of me. This is by supererogation that we have those kinds of thoughts. If I preach the gospel, it's no glory to me. This is coming from St. Paul. I'm sorry, St. Paul. Guess what? Everyone's still talking about you. If I preach the gospel, it's no glory for me, for a necessity lieth upon me. I have to preach the gospel. Okay, so that's this different understanding of it's be like, there's this kind of heroic and yet heroic virtue that's coming from the man of great courage who says, I have to defend my country from, the enemy. Who else is going to do it? I have to do it. I mean, there's an obligation, there's a necessity there, but it's certainly from virtue, not from constraint. So there's the people who were, when you're 18, you have to sign up to be conscripted eventually if we go to war. But then there's the people who voluntarily sign up, say, no, our country needs to be defended. So there's no merit for those of us who would have gone because we had to. We were, it would have been illegal. There was no way out. But for those who go voluntarily, because it's necessary, an obligation, there's merit, there's virtue there. So.
And we still celebrate all the veterans, whether they were...
That's true. And they still have the glory.
Yeah.
All right, so this supererogation, that word comes from supererogatio, supererogare. And so erogare, that's the word for to work or to do something. So to perform beyond the call of duty. From Latin, super plus erogare, to expend public funds after asking for the consent of the people. Another usage of the word. The act of performing more than is required by duty, obligation, or need. Above and beyond the call of duty. Supererogation. That's what that word means. Okay. Let's look at... Are we good?
Mm-hmm.
This definition says, in the Roman Catholic Church, actions believed to form a reserve fund of merit that can be drawn on by prayer in favor of sinners. Interesting.
Yes. I've not heard that definition. Where's that from?
I just looked it up on my computer.
It's like Merriman-Webster or something.
I don't know what my computer uses. Apple.
Well, that's an interesting one. Very, very precise, the theological sort of understanding. Supererogation. Okay, let's look at objection 3. Tim, back over to you.
Further, every moral virtue is about matters of action. Now those things which are wrought externally are not things concerning behavior, but concerning handicraft. According to the philosopher. Therefore, since it belongs to justice to produce externally a deed that is just in itself, it seems that justice is not a moral virtue.
Okay, interesting. Let's understand that objection. That's a good objection to understand. Where does this objection lie? What are maybe some of the central kind of concepts or words that he's opposing or contrasting?
The virtue's internal, and justice, we know justice by its external act, basically.
Okay. So, what this is, and this is similar to one of the things that we talked about last week, I think, which is this between art and ethics, this kind of dilemma, that justice is not a work of art. Justice is not based on these notions that we have, that then we just have to work them into the side. And that's where we see these kind of ideological systems of government that come about, where I've got an understanding of man, I've got an understanding, and now the just relationships should look like this. So there's a serious temptation to project onto society or to project on my relations to another person what is not actually just, but what is either my understanding or what I would like to see, or things like that. So that's contrasting with the virtue of justice, which has to understand something of a balance. So the things that are wrought externally are not things concerning behavior, but concerning handicraft. Okay, according to the philosopher. Therefore, since it belongs to justice to produce externally a deed that is just in itself, it seems that justice is not a moral virtue. But if you can produce exteriorly a deed that is just in itself, does that mean that it was from the virtue of justice? Not necessarily.
Yeah. 'Cause
How
if
do
it's
we
out of
understand that?
compulsion is one example, and it's not like a free act of your will to do so.
Right. They told me that I would go to prison if I steal. So I'm not going to steal because I don't want to go to prison. I produced an exterior act of not taking things that belong to others. Avoiding, I didn't take it, but it was not out of virtue. It wasn't out of something in me that rectified my soul in the process. It was simply fear of punishment or something else. But it produced a just act. I did the right thing. But that's where you see there's the difference between justice or the legal system as this kind of educational or pedagogical or artistic means to create something, a just society, as opposed to people spontaneously and readily doing what's right because it's right. Interesting. Let's see what his reply is.
Justice is concerned about external things, not by making them, which pertains to art, but by using them in our dealings with other men.
Very interesting. So, and I think the word here is use. What's the difference between an artistic form of justice and a virtuous form of justice? Do you understand the question?
I think so. I just try to find words to describe what you were just describing as this mistaken idea of justice as a handicraft, or like producing something versus it coming from this ready disposition to behave in a certain way. It's hard to describe.
What about the handshake versus the contract? We used to be a handshake society, now we're a contract society. We used to be able to have an agreement and shake on it, and that was good enough because people, they were willing to do what they agreed to do with a handshake. Now nobody trusts either person, so you got to do a contract that lists out all the different things that happen if you don't, if you neglect to do something. Seems like that's a lack of justice, like moral justice, and it's more like a handicraft form of justice. It's all spelled out for you.
Well, I mean, what I would pull out of what you said that I think is very interesting is it's a transition from a society that whose word is binding. I said so, and I'm bound to it. But who remembers what I said? What exactly did I say? What did I mean when I said that? To have that all spelled out clearly in writing so that it can't be forgotten, right? So a transition from something that, is my word. You can see the risk that's involved when it's just my word.
And you
So
you could be wrong, but then you're still obligated because it's your word. You're still obligated from a moral justice standpoint to do what you said you were going to do.
Right.
Versus being told, well, I didn't do this. What does the contract say? What's my penalty? and not.
Well, sure. Okay, so a contract that's set up in terms of penalties, that would be, I mean, yeah. If you're trying to get away with with doing as much of not what you said you would do in the contract, just because you can deal with the penalties. Yeah, that's a very
It's always
sort
about
of
the other guy.
corrupted,
You're
but
never going to do anything wrong. It's always about the other guy who's not going to do what he's supposed to.
or whatever. But once you have it on paper, once you have it written down, once it's recorded, then you have, so to speak, something objective to work from. Whereas the word that was spoken, and you see in primitive societies that, yeah, certainly there is something that begins with a word, but that once things start to get written down, so that they're not forgotten, so that there's not something that's lost, then that becomes, the focus of matters of justice. And the word is no longer solid enough. Is that a lack of justice? I think it's, and that's where this is interesting. It's not about making things, but by using them. So justice is concerned not with producing a certain effect, but with using different means in order to deal with other men well. So let's see if we can come up with an example. So justice is not about making peace, but justice is about using peace to deal with men well. Make peace, make peace. Justice is not about, let's see if we come up with a better concrete example. Justice is not about,
Like respecting the other person. Like
we're looking at effects that could be produced that would be
well, so like paying somebody the money you owe them, it's not about the money, right? It's about using money to express that you respect the other person as their own
right.
person with dignity.
Yeah, I mean that's
Something like
that's
that.
the kind of like shift that we're looking for in an understanding the virtue of justice, as opposed to just acts, which could come simply from an obligation or a necessity to not have consequences, as opposed to doing the right thing because of that desire to respect the other person, or to enter into dealings with other people as human beings. So to respect justice, not because of the effect that it has, but because it's a means, and what I can by justice do to better my relations with men.
I feel like this is very pertinent to me raising my kids, but I can't quite express it. I'm
if it's
told all
about
the time,
if it's
Dad,
about
it's
the
not
virtues.
fair.
Uh-huh.
That's not fair. You told me we could do something, and now you said we can't. Well, that's because you went and you did X, Y, and Z, and now I took it away from you.
Mm-hmm.
But I told him that I was going to do that, and he worked hard, did all this stuff, and then he messed up. At the very end, I said, sorry, I know you worked hard and did all this stuff, and I told you to do that, but is that just on my part?
Well, once again, what is
Is he right?
the just right? The just act is not the effect
Right.
that's sought in the first place, but in our dealings with others. And I think that if there's that's where mercy and justice.
Then he would say, be merciful.
Well,
Dad, you're not being merciful.
yeah, I know it's awful. Kids can accuse us of the worst things that we never did. Those are good things to discuss. Any other thoughts on this article? Where are we at? We can start Article 4 otherwise. All right, here we go. Article 4. Who's up? Okay.
Article 4, whether justice is in the will as its subject. Objection 1. It would seem that justice is not in the will as its subject. For justice is sometimes called truth. But truth is not in the will, but in the intellect. Therefore, justice is not in the will as its subject.
Okay, do we understand the objection? Do you understand the way that the word subject is being used?
Vaguely.
Okay, so there's the subject. This is like the distinction between subject and object. So the subject is if I'm performing an action, I'm the subject of that action.
Okay.
And then there's the object of my action, whoever's receiving it. So if I throw the ball at you, I'm the subject, you're the object. I'm throwing the ball, you're getting hit by the ball. Now, it would seem that justice is not in the will as its subject. So it would seem that the place of the will, where it would seem that the place where justice resides is not the will. Why, says the objection? Because it's sometimes called truth. And we know that truth is in the intellect. So we've got two different spiritual faculties, the intellect and the will. And we see that justice is sometimes called truth. So doesn't that mean that the virtue of justice should be somehow modifying the intellect or perfecting the intellect with respect to truth, rather than the will? That's the objection. So, let's see what St. Thomas says. Regina?
On the contrary, Anselm says that justice is the rectitude of the will observed for its own sake.
Okay, so Anselm puts justice in the will.
I answer that. The subject of a virtue is the power whose act that virtue aims at rectifying.
Okay, calm down. Let's understand that real quick. The subject of a virtue is the power whose act that virtue aims at rectifying. So the place where the virtue resides is the power or the capacity or the faculty whose act that virtue aims at rectifying. Is justice rectifying the intellect, or is justice rectifying the will? We'll know where the virtue of justice is situated by the power here used in that sense of capacity or faculty, that whose act that virtue aims at rectifying. All right, the subject is the place where the virtue is rooted, and that place corresponds to the potency whose act is rectified by that virtue. Does that kind of make sense? I mean, terminology might be like grasping a little bit at straws, but as long as we've got where that's coming from, we're good. Okay, keep going.
Now, justice does not aim at directing an act of the cognitive power, for we are not said to be just through knowing something aright.
Okay, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Hence, the subject of justice is not the intellect or reason, which is a cognitive power, but since we are said to be just through doing something aright, and because the proximate principle of action is that
appetitive power.
Appetitive power, justice must needs be in some appetitive power as its subject.
Let's understand that last sentence before we move on. Since we are said to be just through doing something aright, and because the proximate principle of action is the appetitive power, justice must needs be in some appetitive power as its subject. So, since justice results in an action, and that action and action itself is something that comes through an appetitive power, so it's a movement of the appetite that causes action, justice must needs be in some appetitive power as its subject. Justice is modifying how I do something. Not what I think about it, but how I do it. So within that movement into action, justice is taking root. Does that make sense? Pretty
I
much.
just kind of took it as it's not thinking something's right, but doing something right. Instead of thinking, it's doing.
Right, it's doing. So that justice is definitely modifying what I'm doing, not what I'm thinking.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, let's keep going.
Now the appetite is twofold, namely the will, which is in the reason, and the sensitive appetite, which follows on sensitive apprehension, and is divided into the irascible
And the concupiscible.
as stated in the FP.
In the first part.
Oh.
First part. Abbreviation for first part. Okay, so let's just real quick. Appetitive is twofold. So there's the appetite, this is just standard sort of like two ways, the two ways of the Spirit, basically, and then everything that's underneath them, supporting them. Within the intellect, before I can think of something, I have to know it through my senses. I have to have seen, touched, whatever. That's the beginning of knowledge. And that knowledge, there's also then the imagination, which is there synthesizing all of the things that come to me through my experience. And then by that, my intellect illuminating it allows me to secrete a concept that then I keep within my spirit. So there's that, but there's so under, if that's the right word, the intellect, you have this whole living, organic structure that allows me to know something. Now, similarly, willing something, there's this whole structure underneath, because otherwise we would look at the passions and just say they're terrible, awful things. Well, actually, they contribute to me acting well also. So, but they have to just be ordered then. So underneath the will, we have this whole sensitive appetite, sensitive apprehension. I apprehend something that's potentially bad, something that's potentially good, something that makes me afraid, something that excites me. All of those kind of movements that are happening. In a similar way that we come to knowledge by our senses, we also come to movement by our senses. Now there's these affective reactions that we have, irascible and concupiscible. That's the basic division of the passions. The irascible passions, are we familiar with these words a little bit already?
I've heard it, I know concupiscible, but I don't know irascible what it means.
Okay, so the irascible passions are those that drive me towards a good that is difficult to obtain. So hope is one of these irascible passions, whereas the concupiscible passions have to do with the goods, the sensible goods or the sensible evils that are just right next to me. So, for example, the delicious chicken thing that was sitting, I'm drawn to it. I'm by this affection that I have for something that's sensibly good, and that all of those initiate different kinds, or the fear. I look out at the snow and I think about how hard it's going to be driving back. that creates a kind of movement in me. I have to be daring to get on the road. Right? Daring is one of those passions that is on the irascible side. So we've got this kind of twofold division of the will and the intellect, and then within the will, this kind of twofold division of the irascible and the concupiscible on the sensible apprehension, as stated in the first part. So let's keep reading that. Again,
the act of rendering his due to each man cannot proceed from the sensitive appetite, because sensitive apprehension does not go so far as to be able to consider the relation of one thing to another. But this is proper to the reason.
Key. Did we understand that? That's pretty important.
Is it kind of like it's not enough to just do the right thing because it feels right, or because you want to avoid some sensible punishment or something, but rather like you have to choose it out of the good for the other person.
Right. So the act of rendering to someone what's due to them, it can't come from just my feeling of good or bad, just as it's in me. I have to take whatever I'm feeling up to a higher level where I'm able to consider the relation of one thing to another. So that's where whatever I'm feeling, I have to come up to this level of reason in order to then render to someone what's due them. I can't even come up with what's due them so long as I'm in just the passionate experience that I'm having, or the emotional experience that I'm having, or the feeling of good or the feeling of bad. I have to actually come out to something above those sensations in order to give to someone what's due. I can't feel for someone else. My feelings are mine. Even empathy, even compassion is limited in that, to a certain extent, it's my own feelings that I have. It's not someone else's. So the only way for me to come out of, to come to a true kind of empathy or a true kind of compassion, is to actually understand what the other person's needs are, what is actually due them. Okay. There's that objective level. So the irascible, concupiscible passions are tied to the sensible apprehension in the subject. Any reaction or motion based on sensitive apprehension in the passions is first rectified by fortitude or temperance. What would be just is not first perceived by the senses, but rather known by human reason through the consideration of how two things are related. The knowledge of what is equal or just then becomes the principle of a just act, and the object of the virtue of justice when it determines action. So there is a kind of knowledge that's required for justice. But justice in its action modifies the will, doesn't modify the intellect. Because what we're trying to understand is how it is that justice depends so much on something rational, and yet at the same time has this effect on the will. Like what's actually being changed is my action, my motion, my movement, right? That act that's taking place. But it's because of something that I discern. I have to discern something objectively. Whereas temperance is simply putting the brakes on a passionate movement towards a sensible good. Right? Temperance just says, tempers the greatest pleasure. Just like puts the brakes. That's what temperance does. Brakes. Fortitude, that perfects my irascible passion, so that the anger, the drive that's in me is focused well and is not doesn't move me beyond reason. So even, whatever. Now, justice is driven to motion by something that only the intellect can grasp. And that's interesting, as we see how justice is, in a certain way, in its content, dependent on reason. Whereas temperance, it's the movement itself that is controlled. It's the movement of the irascible passion. It's the movement of the concupiscible passion that's controlled. And of course, there's an interaction with reason, but it's not as the same as justice, where justice is really separate from my feelings. Whereas my feelings, temperance, and fortitude need to be rectifying those. Justice and truth are associated because both have to do with the rectitude of man's reason. Truth has to do with the rectitude of the reason as such, and it is impressed on the will. And as it is impressed on the will, it receives the name of justice through action. So it's interesting. Truth impressed on the will. That's what justice is. Okay, finish that, and then that'll be the end of today, just the body of the article. Therefore,
justice cannot be in the irascible or concupiscible as its subject, but only in the will. Hence the philosopher defines justice by an act of the will, as may be seen above.
Great. Okay. So any questions and things that you have, great. Write them down so that we don't forget them. Possible discussion subjects. And we'll definitely take them on Friday, but we could also take some tomorrow. So we'll be continuing with this tomorrow. Peace, love, and harmony. Drive safe.
Thanks, Father.